The global ocean covers 71% of the surface of our planet. Beneath its shimmering surface lies a world teeming with live clownfish darting between anemone tentacles, vast schools of silverfish turning as one, humpbacked whales drifting through blue water in slow, unhurried arcs, coral reefs burst with color, sea turtles glide through shafts of sunlight. Every direction holds something alive, something moving, something vivid. This is the ocean most of us know, the one we photograph, the one we swim in, the one we imagine when we close our eyes and think of the sea. It is generous with its beauty, warm, clear, close to the surface. But this ocean is not the whole ocean. The sunlit zone reaches only about 200 meters down. Below that, the light begins to fade, first red, then orange, then yellow, until only a cold blue remains, and then even that is gone. The ocean's average depth is nearly 4 kilometers. Its deepest point descends to almost 11. What fills that vast, dark space is not simply deeper water. It is a different world entirely, one that has existed since the ocean formed, and one that no sunlight has ever touched. If you enjoy drifting into the deep ocean and discovering what lies beneath, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Are you ready? Let's begin. Light does not travel through water the way it travels through air. In air, light can cross continents. It can travel from the surface of the sun to the surface of the earth, a distance of 150 million kilometers in approximately 8 minutes. It can illuminate a landscape from horizon to horizon, reflect from every surface, scatter from every particle in the atmosphere, and arrive at your eye from every direction simultaneously. The world you see when you look at a sunlit landscape is a world saturated with light. Light coming directly from the source, light reflected from the ground, light scattered from the air, light bouncing between surfaces in a complex web of illumination that reaches into every shadow and corner. In water, this does not happen. Water is a much denser medium than air. It contains molecules that absorb certain wavelengths of light with extraordinary efficiency. Even the clearest ocean water, the deep, open ocean water far from coastlines, with minimal suspended particles or dissolved organic material, absorbs and scatters light at rates that would be catastrophic for any above-water landscape. The difference between the behavior of light in air and in water is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. The first thing water does to light is remove its colors. Sunlight is not a single thing. It is a mixture of electromagnetic radiation across a broad spectrum wavelengths ranging from the ultraviolet, which is invisible to human eyes, through the visible spectrum of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, and into the infrared, also invisible, which we perceive as heat. When sunlight enters the ocean, these different wavelengths behave very differently. Red light is absorbed rapidly within the first few meters of water depth. Orange light disappears within tens of meters. Yellow follows. By the time you reach 100 meters of depth in even the clearest ocean water, only blue and violet light remain. The rich, full-spectrum daylight of the surface has been reduced to a narrow band of blue. This is why the ocean looks blue. Not because water is inherently blue. Pure water is actually very slightly blue, but not for the reason most people think. The ocean appears blue because blue is the wavelength of light that water absorbs least efficiently and therefore transmits furthest. Every other color is filtered out on the way down, and the blue that remains scatters in all directions, filling the water with its characteristic color. At 200 meters, even the blue is fading. The light that reaches this depth is dim, not the comfortable dimness of twilight, but the dimness of a room lit by a single candle at the far end. Enough to see, not enough to read, not enough to do photosynthesis. The photosynthesis that sustains the ocean's biological productivity stops at around 200 meters. This is the boundary of the euphotic zone, the sunlit layer where plant life can exist. Below 200 meters, the dimness deepens rapidly. At 400 meters, the light is barely perceptible to the human eye, a faint blue twilight, present but barely functional. Marine biologists define this as the dysphotic zone, the twilight zone, the mesopelagic, a layer where some light is present but not enough for photosynthesis. Organisms here can detect a faint signal of light from above. They can tell, dimly, that there is a direction called up, where slightly more photons are arriving than from any other direction. At 1,000 meters, this signal is gone, not diminished, not faded to a level that requires sensitive instruments to detect, gone below the threshold of detection for any biological photoreceptor, beyond the ability of any eye evolved by any organism to perceive. The water below 1,000 meters is, by any meaningful biological definition, dark. The zone below 1,000 meters is called the bathypelagic zone, or the midnight zone. The name is apt but insufficient. Midnight, at the surface, still has starlight, moonlight, the glow of bioluminescence from organisms near the surface, the faint illumination of the atmosphere itself. Midnight is not actually dark. The midnight zone of the ocean is actually dark, a darkness that has no equivalent in any environment a human being can naturally access. To understand what this darkness means, you need to understand what light does for the organisms that live in it. Light is not merely illumination, it is information. For organisms that can detect it, light provides spatial information where objects are, how far away they are, what their surfaces look like. It provides temporal information, the daily cycle of light and dark, tells organisms when to be active, when to rest, when to feed, when to hide. It provides navigational information, the direction of the sun, the angle of light through the water, the polarization patterns that some animals use to orient themselves. For organisms in the lit zones of the ocean, light is the primary medium through which the world is perceived. Below 1,000 meters, all of this is gone. The organisms that live in the midnight zone, and there are many of them, distributed throughout a volume of water that comprises the majority of the habitable space in the ocean, must navigate, hunt, find mates, avoid predators, and carry out all the activities of life in conditions of complete darkness. Some of them have evolved eyes of extraordinary sensitivity, eyes so large relative to their body size that they approach the physical limits of optical performance. Eyes that can detect the faintest possible signal of light with the maximum possible efficiency. But even these extraordinary instruments are reaching toward light that is not there. In the true midnight zone, below about 700 to 800 meters, even the most sensitive biological eye can detect nothing. The darkness is absolute. Others have abandoned eyes entirely. There are fish in the deep ocean that are completely eyeless, not born blind, but evolved over millions of generations to a point where eyes confer no advantage, and the metabolic cost of maintaining them has been eliminated. These organisms navigate their world entirely by other means, by the lateral line system that detects pressure waves in the water, by chemoreception that detects chemical gradients in the water, by mechanoreception that detects the movement of currents and the presence of obstacles. They have developed, over evolutionary time, a complete sensory world that does not involve light at all. These are not degraded organisms, impoverished by the absence of the sense that seems most important to us. They are fully adapted to their environment, more completely adapted, in some cases, than surface organisms are to theirs. They live in a darkness that has been constant for the entire history of their lineage, and their sensory systems reflect that constancy with the precision of evolutionary optimization. But the darkness they live in is not featureless. It is not simply the absence of something. It has its own structure, its own dynamics, its own sources of information and energy. The midnight zone is not a void. It is a world that light has never touched. The pressure in the midnight zone would kill a human being instantly. This is important to understand not because it is a dramatic fact, though it is, but because it explains why the midnight zone remained entirely unknown to science until very recently, and why what we know about it remains so incomplete. At the ocean's surface, the pressure is approximately 1 atmosphere, the weight of the column of air above the surface distributed across the area. At 1,000 meters of depth, the pressure is approximately 100 atmospheres, 100 times greater than at the surface, equivalent to the weight of 100 meters of air stacked above every square centimeter of surface. At 4,000 meters, a typical depth for the abyssal plain, the pressure is approximately 400 atmospheres. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, nearly 11,000 meters down, the pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres. Human beings cannot survive these pressures. The gas spaces in the body, the lungs, the sinuses, the middle ear collapse. The nitrogen dissolved in the blood behaves in ways that are toxic at high pressure. The physical structures of the body, adapted to the single atmosphere of the surface, cannot maintain their integrity under the compressive force of a kilometer or more of water above them. This means that every observation of the midnight zone has been made by instrument, by cameras lowered on cables, by sonar systems mapping the seafloor from above, by remotely operated vehicles and autonomous underwater vehicles carrying lights and sensors into depths that no unprotected human body could reach. The organisms of the midnight zone have been studied, when they have been studied at all, through images and samples through the bodies of animals brought to the surface in nets, often dead or dying from the decompression, and through the footage from cameras carried by machines into depths where no human being has ever been. What those cameras have shown has expanded and complicated, and in some cases, completely overturned what scientists thought they knew about life in the deep ocean. The midnight zone was once assumed to be nearly lifeless. The reasoning was logical. With no photosynthesis, there is no primary production, no plants converting sunlight into organic material, no base to the food web. The only food available is what falls from above the organic material produced in the sunlit surface waters that sinks as organisms die and are consumed and their remains drift downward. Marine snow. This flux of organic material decreases exponentially with depth. By the time it reaches 1,000 meters, most of it has been consumed by organisms in the mesopelagic zone. By the time it reaches 4,000 meters, what remains is a tiny fraction of what left the surface. On this reasoning, the abyssal plain, the vast, flat, dark seafloor that covers more than half of the Earth's surface, should be nearly empty. The energy arriving there is too small to support significant biological communities. It is not empty. Every expedition that has reached the abyssal plain has found life. Not abundant life, not the dense communities of the sunlit surface, but life organisms adapted to the extreme conditions of cold and pressure and darkness, surviving on the meager energy that reaches their world, reproducing, diversifying, filling ecological roles. Some of these organisms feed on the marine snow that reaches them. Some feed on other organisms that feed on the marine snow. Some have evolved to exploit the occasional larger inputs of organic material that reach the seafloor. The bodies of large animals, whales and sharks, that sink through the water column when they die and arrive on the seafloor as concentrated packages of energy that can sustain biological communities for years. These whale falls, as they are called, are oases in the desert of the abyssal plain, temporary, unpredictable, but enormously productive when they occur. Others have found energy sources that have nothing to do with the sunlit surface at all. The discovery of hydrothermal vents in 1977 was one of the most significant biological discoveries in the history of science. The scientific team that first observed them aboard the research submersible Alvin, diving to the seafloor at the Galapagos Rift, expected to find a bare, cold, dark seafloor inhabited by a few sparse organisms surviving on marine snow. Instead, they found dense communities of organisms living around hot water venting from the seafloor tube. Worms meters long, clams the size of dinner plates, crabs, fish, shrimp, all in quantities and sizes that were completely inconsistent with the expected energy budget of the deep ocean. The source of energy for these communities was not sunlight, it was chemical. Specifically, the chemical energy in hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas released by the hot water venting from the Earth's interior, which was being used by bacteria as an energy source in a process called chemosynthesis. These bacteria, living in conditions that would kill any surface organism, extreme heat, extreme pressure, complete darkness, toxic chemistry were the base of a food web that supported rich biological communities in a place where, according to every previous model of deep-sea ecology, nothing significant should have been living. The discovery of hydrothermal vent communities demonstrated something that has continued to be confirmed by every subsequent expedition to the deep ocean. The darkness is not a barrier to life. It is an environment. And environments, regardless of how extreme they are by the standards of the surface world, tend to be inhabited. The organisms that live in the midnight zone have had tens of millions of years to adapt to its conditions. This is a long time. The entire history of modern human civilization is less than 10,000 years. The hominid lineage, the evolutionary line leading to humans, is approximately 6 million years old. The mammals as a class have existed for roughly 200 million years. The animals that have been living in the midnight zone for tens of millions of years have had evolutionary time on their side in ways that are difficult to comprehend. What does tens of millions of years of adaptation to complete darkness produce? It produces eyes that are nothing like human eyes. The deep-sea dragonfish, a small predatory fish found in the mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones, has eyes that are oriented upward permanently, because the only light that exists at any depth is the faint signal from above. These eyes are not looking at a scene. They are looking for silhouettes for the shapes of organisms between the fish and whatever faint light exists above it, a visual strategy that is completely alien to the way human eyes work. It produces bodies that glow. Bioluminescence, the production of light by living organisms through chemical reactions, is one of the most widespread biological phenomena in the ocean. Estimates suggest that more than 90% of deep-sea organisms can produce light. Not all of them do so all the time, or in the same way, or for the same purposes. Some use it to attract prey, the anglerfish's famous lure, a bioluminescent appendage that dangles in front of the fish's enormous jaws, producing light that draws other organisms toward their death. Some use it to communicate complex patterns of light that convey information between members of a species. Some use it for counter-illumination, producing light on their undersides to match the faint glow from above, making them invisible to predators looking upward from below. Bioluminescence in the deep ocean is not decorative. It is functional, evolved over millions of years to serve specific purposes in an environment where the production and detection of light can mean the difference between eating and being eaten. The patterns of bioluminescent light that organisms produce are as information-rich and specific as the visual signals of any surface organism. They are a language, written in light, in a world that is otherwise completely dark. It produces bodies that are adapted to pressure in ways that surface organisms cannot be. The cells of deep-sea organisms have membranes with different compositions than surface organisms, specifically adapted to remain fluid and functional at the pressures of the midnight zone, pressures that would make the cell membranes of surface organisms rigid and non-functional. Their proteins fold differently. Their biochemistry operates differently. They are not simply surface organisms that have moved deep. They are organisms that have been remade at the molecular level by the conditions of their environment. It produces organisms that live slowly. The cold temperatures of the deep ocean, typically around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius in the bathypelagic zone, slow the metabolic rate of ectothermic organisms dramatically. Deep-sea fish have heart rates that are a small fraction of those of comparable surface fish. Their digestion is slow. Their growth is slow. Their reproduction is slow. Some deep-sea organisms are extraordinarily long-lived. The Greenland shark, which can reach the deep ocean, has been found to live for more than 400 years. Deep-sea tube worms at hydrothermal vents may live for centuries. The rhythm of life in the midnight zone is different from the rhythm of life at the surface, slower, more patient, adapted to an environment where energy is scarce and must be used with extreme efficiency. It produces organisms that are, by the standards of surface life, profoundly strange. The barrel-eye fish has a transparent head. Its eyes, which are the green cylindrical structures visible through the transparent dome of its skull, can rotate to look upward or forward, and are sensitive enough to detect the faintest bioluminescent flashes in the surrounding darkness. The transparent head is not an accident or a curiosity. It is an adaptation. It allows the barrel eye to look upward without the obstruction of its own snout, to see the silhouettes of organisms above it and the bioluminescent signals around it without the structural interference that an opaque head would create. The viperfish has teeth so large relative to its jaw that it cannot close its mouth. Its teeth are not contained by its jaw but extend outside it, curving back toward its eyes. In the darkness of the midnight zone, where prey is scarce and encounters are unpredictable, having teeth that can impale a prey organism regardless of the angle of the strike is a significant advantage. The viperfish does not need to aim with precision. It needs to catch whatever it encounters, and its body has been shaped by evolution to do exactly that. The anglerfish, perhaps the most famous of the deep-sea organisms, the one that appears in documentaries and children's books as the symbol of deep ocean strangeness, has a reproductive strategy that is unlike that of any other vertebrate. In many species, the male anglerfish is dramatically smaller than the female, so small that, when he finds a female, he bites into her body and physically fuses with her, his circulatory system connecting to hers, his body gradually becoming a parasitic appendage of the female's body. He loses his eyes, he loses his fins, he loses his internal organs, one by one, as his body is absorbed into the female. Eventually, all that remains of the male are his testes, providing sperm to the female on demand. In an environment where finding a mate is an extraordinarily rare event, the midnight zone is vast, and organisms are sparse. Having a guaranteed source of sperm permanently attached to the female's body is a reproductive strategy of ruthless efficiency. These are not monsters. They are not aberrations. They are the products of tens of millions of years of evolution in conditions that are extreme by surface standards, but entirely normal for the organisms that inhabit them. The midnight zone has been their world for longer than most of the surface organisms we know have existed. They are at home in the dark in a way that nothing from the surface world can be. The darkness of the deep ocean is not the same throughout the water column. Between the sunlit surface and the absolute darkness of the midnight zone, there is a transition, a zone of deepening twilight that is neither bright nor completely dark, that has its own biological communities adapted to its intermediate conditions, that plays roles in the ocean's ecology that are only beginning to be understood. This transition zone is the mesopelagic, sometimes called the twilight zone, sometimes the dysphotic zone, sometimes simply the middle ocean. It extends from approximately 200 meters, where photosynthesis becomes impossible, to approximately 1,000 meters, where biological detection of light becomes impossible. It is a layer roughly 800 meters thick, wrapped around the entire planet, inhabited by organisms that live in conditions of perpetual dim blue twilight and must navigate the boundary between the lit world above and the dark world below. The mesopelagic is, in terms of total biomass, one of the most significant biological zones in the ocean. It contains enormous quantities of organisms, fish, squid, crustaceans, gelatinous organisms that have evolved to exploit the resources of both the surface zone above and the darkness below. Many of them are vertical migrants, organisms that spend their days in the dim safety of the mesopelagic, where the darkness partially conceals them from visual predators, and rise to the surface at night to feed in the productive surface waters, descending again before dawn. This vertical migration, the daily movement of enormous quantities of biomass from the mesopelagic to the surface and back, is one of the largest coordinated biological events on Earth. It happens every day, in every ocean, involving quantities of organisms that are difficult to estimate, but are certainly enormous. The sonar displays of research vessels crossing the open ocean show it as a thick layer. The deep, scattering layer that rises toward the surface at dusk and descends again at dawn. A daily pulse of life moving through the water column. The ecological significance of this migration is profound. The organisms making it bring carbon fixed at the surface down into the deep ocean and bring nutrients from the deep back up to the surface. They are a biological pump-moving material between the lit surface and the dark deep in ways that affect the chemistry of the ocean and, ultimately, the chemistry of the atmosphere. The carbon that these organisms carry into the deep ocean when they descend is carbon that may not return to the surface for decades or centuries, effectively removing it from the short-term carbon cycle. The mesopelagic migration is not merely a biological curiosity. It is a mechanism that affects the global climate, and it happens entirely in the dark or near dark. The organisms making this daily migration are navigating by the faint light of the mesopelagic twilight, using their extraordinarily sensitive eyes to detect the changes in light intensity that signal dawn and dusk, making their migrations with a precision that is all the more remarkable for occurring in conditions that will leave a human being completely disoriented. Below the mesopelagic, in the midnight zone itself, the darkness is uniform and permanent. There is no daily cycle of light. There is no dusk and no dawn. The only light that exists is the light that organisms produce themselves bioluminescence, flashing and pulsing in patterns that serve specific biological functions. In a darkness that makes every flash potentially visible across distances that would be invisible in the noise of a lit environment. This bioluminescence is not random. It is structured, patterned, specific. Different species produce different patterns, different colors, different pulse rates, different spatial arrangements. The darkness of the midnight zone, far from making visual communication impossible, actually makes it exquisitely precise. In the complete absence of ambient light, any bioluminescent signal is perfectly distinct against the background. There's no noise, no glare, no competing illumination. Every flash is a signal in a medium of absolute silence. The human experience of darkness is not darkness. This is worth saying explicitly, because the word darkness means different things in different contexts, and the darkness of the surface world that human beings experience is not even remotely comparable to the darkness of the midnight zone. The darkest place a human being can naturally access on the surface of the earth is still not dark. On the darkest night, in the most remote location, far from any artificial light source, the night sky provides illumination starlight scattered across the dome of the sky, providing enough light that a dark adapted human eye can make out the horizon, can see the silhouettes of trees and mountains, can navigate without stumbling. The human visual system, given 30 to 40 minutes to fully dark adapt, can detect very small quantities of light. In a windowless room, in a building, with all light sources off, the darkness is closer to real darkness. But even here, the eyes eventually begin to detect the faint signals of their own biochemistry, the photons generated by the retinal cells themselves in the absence of external stimulation. People in sensory deprivation environments report visual phenomena not because there is light, but because the visual system, deprived of its normal input, begins to generate its own signals. The midnight zone of the ocean is darker than any of this. It is dark enough that the visual system of any surface organism would find nothing to detect. Not faint glimmers, not shadows, not the faint self-generated signals of dark-adapted retinal cells. Nothing. The photon flux at 1,000 meters of depth in the open ocean is below the detection threshold of any biological photoreceptor designed for surface conditions. Scientists who work with deep-sea camera systems deploying cameras to the midnight zone and examining the footage must work with imaging systems that are orders of magnitude more sensitive than the human eye. When these cameras are deployed without any artificial light, they capture images that are essentially black, occasionally punctuated by the brief flashes of bioluminescent organisms passing through the field of view, but otherwise completely featureless. There is nothing to see because there is nothing to see by. The experience of the midnight zone is, by human standards, the experience of non-existence. There is no visual input. There is no way to orient by light. There is no concept of direction that light can provide. The world, experienced through the sensory systems of a surface organism, would be nothing a complete absence of the information that light provides, an experience that would very quickly become disorienting and terrifying. The organisms that live there do not experience it this way. They do not experience the darkness as an absence. It is simply their world. They have not lost something. They were never given something that surface organisms have. Their sensory worlds are built around other inputs: pressure, chemistry, temperature, bioluminescence, and those inputs constitute a complete and functional experience of their environment. But from the perspective of a surface organism, from the perspective of any human being who has ever been afraid of the dark, the midnight zone is a realization of that fear on a planetary scale. Not the temporary darkness of a power outage or a windowless room, not the relative darkness of a moonless night. The permanent, absolute, unrelieved darkness of a volume of water that covers most of the Earth's surface and reaches to depths that dwarf any human structure. The light that is shining right now on the surface of the ocean above the midnight zone does not reach it, has never reached it, will never reach it, as long as the ocean exists. Below a certain depth, the universe simply ends for light. And in the darkness beyond that depth, the ocean goes on cold, pressurized, inhabited, ancient for kilometers more. There is a paradox at the heart of deep ocean darkness, and it is this. The darkness that makes the midnight zone so extreme by surface standards is also what makes it, in certain ways, a more stable and predictable environment than the surface. The surface of the ocean is a dynamic, turbulent, constantly changing environment. Temperature fluctuates. Salinity fluctuates. Light levels change dramatically between day and night, between seasons, between years. Storms disturb the surface, mixing the water column, disrupting the layers of temperature and chemistry that organisms depend on. The surface world is a world of change, the same change that drives the productivity and diversity of surface ecosystems, but also a world that demands constant adaptation from the organisms that live in it. The midnight zone changes slowly, very slowly. The temperature of deep ocean water is remarkably stable. Below the thermocline, the layer of rapidly decreasing temperature that separates the warm surface water from the cold deep. The water is cold and stays cold. The deep Atlantic, the deep Pacific, the deep Indian Ocean all have water temperatures that hover around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius year-round, decade after decade. There's no seasonal variation. There's no daily variation. The cold is constant. The pressure is constant. The chemistry, the concentration of oxygen, the pH, the salinity is stable in ways that surface water is not. There are no storms in the midnight zone. There are no waves. The currents exist, but they are slow. The thermohaline circulation that moves deep water around the globe operates on timescales of centuries to millennia. The water that is at the bottom of the Atlantic today may have sunk from the surface near Greenland 1,000 years ago. It is old water in terms of the time it has spent in the deep ocean, and it is stable water. This stability has consequences for the organisms that live there. They do not need to cope with temperature fluctuations. They do not need to time their activities to a daily light cycle. They do not need to adapt to seasonal changes in food availability. What they do need to cope with extreme cold, extreme pressure, near total absence of food energy are challenges that change very little over time. The adaptations that work in the midnight zone today are adaptations that worked in the midnight zone 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago. This temporal stability, the constancy of the environment over long periods, may be one reason that the deep ocean harbors organisms that have changed very little over geological time. There are species in the deep ocean that belong to lineages that were old when the dinosaurs were young, species whose basic body plan has been stable for tens of millions of years because the environment they live in has been stable for tens of millions of years. The darkness that makes the midnight zone seem like an extreme environment by surface standards has, paradoxically, created one of the most stable and evolutionarily conservative habitats on Earth. What does it feel like to be in complete darkness. Not the darkness of a room or a cave. Not the darkness of a moonless night. The darkness of a place where no light has ever existed. Where the concept of seeing has no meaning because there is nothing to see by. Human beings who have been in truly dark environments, sensory deprivation, tanks, underground caves, far from any artificial light source. The deepest parts of minds report consistent experiences. Initially, the eyes search for light, any pattern. The brain, expecting visual input that does not come, begins to generate its own. People see shapes, colors, movements, not because these things are present, but because the visual processing system, starved of its normal input, begins to hallucinate. After a time, this subsides. The visual system accepts its deprivation. What remains is a quality of attention that shifts to other senses: sound, touch, proprioception. People become acutely aware of their own heartbeat, their breathing, the feeling of air on their skin. The world contracts to the body. Space, which usually extends outward in all directions to the limits of vision, collapses to the dimensions of the physical form. This is still not the darkness of the midnight zone. The darkness of a sensory deprivation tank is temporary, chosen, reversible. The darkness of the midnight zone is permanent, unchosen, and extends in every direction for distances that exceed the reach of any sense. The organisms that live there are not experiencing temporary sensory deprivation. They are living in an environment where light is simply not a category, where the absence of light is not an absence of something, but simply the way things are. To understand the midnight zone, you have to set aside the assumption that darkness is the absence of something. Darkness is not an absence in the midnight zone. It is a condition, a specific, stable, long-standing condition that has shaped the organisms that live in it as precisely as light has shaped the organisms of the surface. The midnight zone is not dark the way a room is dark when the lights are turned off. It is dark the way the center of a planet is dark permanently, profoundly, in a way that has nothing to do with the failure of light sources and everything to do with the fundamental geometry of where you are. Below 1,000 meters, light cannot reach you regardless of how powerful its source at the surface might be. This is not a technical limitation. It is a physical one. The water absorbs the light. Every meter of water between you and the surface takes some of it away. By the time 1,000 meters of water stands between you and the surface, nothing remains. Nothing. The midnight zone is where light ends. Right now, while you listen to this, the midnight zone exists. Below the ocean surface, at this moment, the world ends for light at approximately 1,000 meters. Below that depth in water that covers more than half the surface of the Earth, in a volume of water that dwarfs every other habitat on this planet, total darkness prevails. Has prevailed since the ocean formed. Will prevail until the ocean is gone. In that darkness, organisms move. The viperfish opens its mouth in the dark, teeth extended, waiting. The anglerfish pulses its lure, the blue-green light hanging in the blackness, a lethal signal in an otherwise silent world. The giant squid animals that can reach lengths of 13 meters, the largest invertebrates on Earth, cruise through water that has never been touched by sunlight, hunting in darkness so complete that their eyes, the largest eyes of any living animal, may be adapted to detect the bioluminescent flashes of their prey rather than any ambient light. The barrel-eye fish rotates its tubular eyes upward, scanning for silhouettes. The dragonfish produces a red light from a photophore below its eye, red light that it can see, that its prey cannot, a private illumination in the darkness that is invisible to the organisms it hunts. The hagfish, an ancient lineage that predates the vertebrates, animals that have been essentially unchanged for 500 million years, moves through the sediment at the bottom of the midnight zone, sensing the chemical signals of decay. These animals have never seen the sun. Their parents had never seen the sun. Their ancestors have never seen the sun, back through evolutionary time for tens of millions of years, to a point when their lineage first descended into the darkness and found it habitable. They live in a world defined by darkness, the way the surface world is defined by light, not as an absence, not as a limitation, but as the fundamental condition of existence. The midnight zone is the largest habitable space on Earth by volume. It is also the least known, the least understood, the least explored. Every expedition that reaches it finds things that were not expected. New species, new behaviors, new ecological relationships, new physical phenomena. The darkness that makes it inaccessible to surface observation has preserved its secrets more effectively than any other barrier on Earth. We have mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than we have mapped the Midnight Zone. We know more about the geology of the Moon than we know about the biology of the abyssal plain. The darkness that starts at 1,000 meters and extends to nearly 11,000 meters is, in practical terms, as remote from human knowledge as the surface of another planet. And in that darkness, right now, in water that has never been touched by light and never will be, something is alive, something is moving, something is hunting or hiding or reproducing or dying in conditions that would be instantly fatal to any surface organism, in a darkness that is total and permanent and ancient. Something is alive in the dark. We are only beginning to learn what. The deep ocean is not a place that science has finished with. It is a place that science has barely started. The technologies that allow us to observe the Midnight Zone remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, deep-sea cameras, acoustic mapping systems have existed in anything like their current form for only a few decades. The first ROV, capable of reaching significant depths, was developed in the 1960s. The first comprehensive acoustic mapping of large areas of the deep seafloor was conducted in the 1970s and 1980s. The first expeditions to hydrothermal vents, which revealed that the deep ocean could support dense biological communities without any input from the surface, took place in 1977. The technology that allows scientists to observe the Midnight Zone in real time, to send images from kilometers below the surface as the ROV moves through the darkness, is a product of the last 30 to 40 years. In those 30 to 40 years, every expedition to the Midnight Zone has found things that were not expected. New species, discovered at a rate that would be remarkable in any environment, are found in the deep ocean routinely. New behaviors, never observed before, are recorded by deep-sea cameras. New ecological relationships, new physical phenomena, new evidence that the models used to understand the deep ocean need to be revised. These are the consistent products of every expedition that manages to reach the midnight zone and look around. The darkness has not been kind to the accumulation of knowledge. It has concealed what is there not through any active resistance, but through the simple physics of being inaccessible. A deep-sea organism cannot be observed from the surface, cannot be photographed from above, cannot be studied remotely without deploying technology that reaches it. The investment required to study the midnight zone is orders of magnitude greater than the investment required to study surface environments for a much smaller return of observation time. An ROV dive to 3,000 meters takes hours just to descend and ascend, leaving perhaps a few hours of observation time at depth before the vehicle must be recovered. In those few hours, an area the size of a few city blocks can be surveyed. The midnight zone covers hundreds of millions of square kilometers. The ratio between what we have seen and what exists to be seen is, by any honest assessment, extremely small. We have glimpsed the midnight zone through a very few windows, in a very few places, over a very short period of time. What we have seen through those windows has been extraordinary, has changed fundamental assumptions about where life can exist, what it can survive, how it derives energy, how it behaves in darkness. What exists beyond those windows, in the vast darkness that has not been observed, can only be guessed at. The guesses, when they are informed by what has already been found, are humbling. If the rate of species discovery in the deep ocean continues at anything like its current pace, the number of unknown species in the midnight zone is likely in the hundreds of thousands, possibly more. The Census of Marine Life, a decade-long project that concluded in 2010, estimated that roughly 250,000 species of marine organisms were known to science at that time, and suggested that the true total might be 750,000 or more. Since 2010, new species from the deep ocean have continued to be described at a significant rate, and the consensus among deep-sea biologists is that the total number of species in the deep ocean is very large, much larger than the current catalog reflects. These unknown species are not trivially different variants of known organisms. They are, in many cases, organisms belonging to lineages that have been separated from their surface relatives for tens of millions of years, living in conditions so different from the surface that they have been shaped by evolution into forms that bear only a structural resemblance to anything familiar. The deep ocean is not simply a dark version of the surface ocean. It is a different world, inhabited by organisms that are as alien to surface biology as anything that science fiction has imagined. And it is right here. Not on another planet, not in some speculative future. Here, now, covering more than half the surface of the earth, reaching depths that would make a mockery of the tallest mountain, inhabited by organisms that have never seen light and never will, living their complete and functional lives in a darkness that has no analog in any environment a human being has ever experienced. The light at the surface of the ocean today carries energy that began its journey 150 million kilometers away at the surface of the sun. It took approximately 8 minutes to cross that distance, moving at 300,000 kilometers per second. It entered the ocean. It was absorbed, scattered, reduced, wavelength by wavelength, as it moved downward through the water. At 10 meters, most of the red light was gone. At 50 meters, the orange was fading. At 100 meters, the light was almost entirely blue. At 200 meters, even the blue was dim, not gone, but reduced to a fraction of its surface intensity. At 500 meters, it was a ghost of itself, detectable by extremely sensitive instruments, detectable by the most extraordinary eyes in the animal kingdom, but functionally absent for most biological purposes. At 800 meters, the last biological photoreceptors capable of detecting it were reaching their limits. At 1,000 meters, it was gone. Below 1,000 meters, the light that left the sun 8 minutes ago, that traveled 150 million kilometers, that entered the ocean and moved downward through a kilometer of water, is simply absent. Every photon has been absorbed. The energy it carried has been converted to heat, scattered, distributed through the water. The light itself no longer exists. And below 1,000 meters, the darkness extends down through the bathypelagic zone, where the midnight zone begins in earnest, where the pressure is 100 atmospheres, and the temperature is 4 degrees, and the darkness is total, down through the abyssal zone, where the seafloor begins at 3,000 to 4,000 meters, and the pressure is 300 to 400 atmospheres. And the darkness is the same total darkness that has prevailed at every depth below 1,000 meters, down through the Hadal zone, the trenches, the places where tectonic plates are subducting, and the seafloor descends to depths of 6,000 meters and beyond, down to the Challenger Deep, 10,916 meters below the surface, where the pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres, and the temperature is near freezing, and the darkness is, as it has always been, absolute. The darkness does not change with depth below 1,000 meters. It cannot become darker than total. What changes with depth is the pressure and the temperature and the composition of the biological communities adapted to those conditions. But the darkness, the complete, permanent, unvarying absence of any photon from any external source, is the same at 1,000 meters as it is at 10,000 meters. From 1,000 meters down, light is simply not a feature of the world. This is not a poetic statement. It is a physical one. The light that illuminates your world right now, the photons bouncing around the room you are in, or the sunlight falling on the landscape outside, or the light from whatever source allows you to read or listen, none of that light, or anything like it, exists below 1,000 meters of ocean. There is a boundary, not a sharp one, but a real one, below which the concept of seeing has no meaning because there is nothing to see by. Above that boundary, the surface world, light, warmth, visual experience, the diurnal cycle of day and night, the seasonal cycle of changing light angles and intensities. Below that boundary, the midnight zone, darkness, cold, pressure, the biological world that has adapted to these conditions over tens of millions of years. A world where light is produced only by living organisms, used only for specific biological purposes, and never exists as ambient illumination. The boundary between these two worlds is not visible from either side. From the surface, the ocean simply deepens. From below, the surface is simply above a direction from which slightly more bioluminescent signals originate than from any other direction. A direction that carries slightly warmer water and slightly more organic material than the directions pointing toward the cold, dark sea floor. Somewhere between these two perspectives, at approximately 1,000 meters, the light ends, and the darkness of the midnight zone goes on, as it has always gone on, as it will continue to go on, patient, cold, inhabited, dark. There is a question that marine biologists return to repeatedly, and it is one that the darkness of the midnight zone makes both more interesting and more difficult to answer. How do organisms find each other in the dark? On the surface, finding another member of your species, whether for mating, for social interaction, for coordinated hunting, or for any other purpose that requires proximity, is primarily a visual task. Animals see each other. They recognize each other by visual signals, coloration, movement, shape, behavioral displays. The visual environment of the surface world is rich with the information that makes social behavior possible. In the midnight zone, this visual environment does not exist. An organism cannot see another organism unless one of them is producing bioluminescent light. And even then, the range at which that light can be detected is limited by the physics of light propagation in water. Two organisms at significant distances from each other, both dark, are essentially invisible to each other by any visual means. And yet organisms in the midnight zone do find each other. They mate, they aggregate. Some of them hunt cooperatively, some of them communicate. The midnight zone is not a world of isolated organisms drifting randomly through the dark, incapable of social connection. It is a world in which social connection happens more slowly, over shorter ranges, using different mechanisms, but happens. The mechanisms are chemical, mechanical, and acoustic. Chemical communication, the production and detection of dissolved chemical signals in the water, is a primary means by which deep-sea organisms find each other. Pheromones, the chemical signals used by many animal species to attract mates, work at distances that can be quite large in still water, as the chemical diffuses outward from the source and creates a gradient that a detecting organism can follow toward its source. Many deep-sea organisms release chemical signals that can be detected by potential mates from significant distances, allowing individuals that cannot see each other to orient toward each other in the darkness. Mechanical detection, the detection of pressure waves in the water, either through a lateral line system or through acoustic receptors, is another primary means of orientation. Water transmits pressure waves very well. The movement of another organism through the water creates pressure disturbances that propagate outward and can be detected by sensitive mechanoreceptors at distances that depend on the size of the disturbance and the sensitivity of the reason. Detector. A large organism moving through the water creates a pressure wake that a smaller predator or prey can detect, not as a sound in the human sense, but as a physical pattern of pressure variation that conveys information about the size, direction, and distance of its source. Acoustic communication. The production and detection of actual sounds, pressure waves in the frequency range that can be produced and detected by biological structures, is used by many marine organisms. The deep ocean is not acoustically silent. Fish produce sounds by vibrating their swim bladders. Invertebrates produce sounds by snapping, clicking, or rubbing body parts together. The sounds produced by organisms in the mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones travel through the SOFAR channel, the acoustic highway that runs through the deep ocean, channeling sound across enormous distances and can be detected far from their source. Bioluminescence, while primarily associated with visual communication, also serves as a medium for finding others in the dark. The specific patterns of bioluminescent signaling that different species produce function as species-specific codes, signals that members of the same species can recognize as distinct from the bioluminescent signals of other species, allowing them to identify potential mates or conspecifics even in conditions where no other visual information is available. The darkness that makes ambient light impossible makes bioluminescent signals uniquely unambiguous. In a world with no background illumination, any produced light is a signal. The result of all these mechanisms working together is a social world in the midnight zone that is, while fundamentally different from the social worlds of surface organisms, no less functional. Deep-sea organisms do find each other. They do mate. They do form aggregations and, in some cases, engage in coordinated behaviors. The darkness that would destroy the social world of any surface organism has not destroyed the social world of the midnight zone. It has reshaped it, creating a set of social mechanisms adapted to the specific physical conditions of the environment. This reshaping is, in its way, a remarkable demonstration of the power of evolution. The social behaviors of surface organisms took tens of millions of years to develop the complex visual communication systems, the elaborate courtship displays, the coordinated group behaviors. The social behaviors of the midnight zone took equally long to develop, but they developed in a completely different direction, constrained by completely different physical possibilities. The result is a social world as complex and as functional as any at the surface, built from entirely different materials. The midnight zone has been dark since before there was life in it. When the first organisms descended below the euphotic zone, the zone where photosynthesis was possible, they were entering a darkness that had existed since the ocean formed. The darkness was not created by the descent of life. It was there waiting, a physical condition of the deep ocean determined by the absorption properties of water and the geometry of the ocean basin. The first organisms to successfully inhabit the midnight zone did so before the darkness was their natural environment. They were surface organisms, or mesopelagic organisms, that found themselves in conditions slightly beyond what their physiology was optimized for. The ones that survived passed on whatever traits allowed them to survive. Their descendants were slightly better adapted. Over generations, thousands of generations, millions of generations, the descendants of those first deep ocean colonists became the organisms that now inhabit the midnight zone, perfectly adapted to a darkness that their ancestors had entered as aliens. This process, the colonization of the midnight zone from the lit surface, followed by millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, has happened multiple times in multiple lineages. The fish of the midnight zone belong to many different evolutionary lineages that have independently descended from shallower ancestors and independently adapted to deep ocean conditions. Each lineage has followed a similar trajectory: the reduction or elimination of eyes, the modification of biochemistry to function at high pressure, the development of bioluminescent capabilities, the shift to chemical and mechanical sensing. But they have followed it independently, each producing the same general suite of adaptations through different evolutionary paths. This convergent evolution, the independent development of similar adaptations in unrelated lineages facing similar environmental challenges, is one of the most powerful demonstrations in biology that environments shape organisms in predictable ways. The darkness of the midnight zone, the pressure, the cold, the scarcity of food. These conditions have the same effects on any lineage that descends into them, regardless of where that lineage started. They favor the same kinds of adaptations. They select for the same kinds of solutions. The midnight zone, in its consistency and stability, has been a remarkably reliable evolutionary sculptor, producing the same forms, independently, in the organisms of many different lineages. This is why the organisms of the midnight zone, despite their strangeness by surface standards, have a coherence, a shared quality that reflects their shared environment. The viperfish and the dragonfish and the anglerfish and the barrel-eye and the gulper eel are all very different organisms, belonging to very different lineages, having descended from very different surface ancestors. But they share a quality, a deep ocean character that reflects the conditions they inhabit. They are all adapted to darkness. They are all adapted to pressure. They are all adapted to the scarcity of food. They are all, in their different ways, the products of the same environment working on different raw materials. The midnight zone has been a consistent force in the evolution of marine life for hundreds of millions of years. The conditions it imposes, darkness, cold, pressure, scarcity, have been shaping organisms since the first organisms descended into it. The organisms that inhabit it today are the current expression of that shaping the most recent iteration of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary response to the same set of conditions. And the conditions continue. The darkness that shaped them is still there. The pressure is still there. The cold is still there. The scarcity is still there. Evolution continues, slowly, in the darkness, as it has always continued, as it will continue for as long as the midnight zone exists, which is to say, for as long as there is an ocean. There is something that the midnight zone teaches about the nature of limits. The surface world has limits, limits of temperature, of chemistry, of radiation, beyond which life becomes impossible. These limits are real. There are places on Earth where the temperature is too high, the chemistry too toxic, the radiation too intense for any organism to survive. Life has limits. But the midnight zone has extended every estimate of where those limits lie. When the first hydrothermal vent communities were discovered, living in temperatures near 400 degrees Celsius in the presence of hydrogen sulfide that would kill a surface organism in seconds, at pressures that would crush any surface body. The previous estimates of the limits of life were revised. When organisms were found in the sediment of the deepest trenches, at pressures exceeding 1,000 atmospheres, surviving on the most meager energy inputs imaginable, the estimates were revised again. Each time the limits have been revised, the revision has been in the same direction. Life is more tolerant of extreme conditions than previously thought. The range of conditions that life can inhabit is broader than the surface world suggests. The midnight zone, in its extreme darkness and cold and pressure, is not beyond life. It is inhabited by life that has found a way, through hundreds of millions of years of evolution, to make a living in conditions that seem to preclude it. This does not mean that life can inhabit any conditions. There are still limits. The interior of the sun is not inhabited. The vacuum of space is not inhabited. The conditions that are genuinely beyond life are real, and they exist. But the midnight zone is not among them. The darkness, the pressure, the cold, these are not beyond life. There are conditions that life has adapted to repeatedly, with the thoroughness and creativity that evolution brings to any problem given enough time. The lesson is not that there are no limits. The lesson is that the limits are further than we think. That the darkness we might imagine as an absolute barrier to life is, in fact, a habitat. That the world that light has never touched is, nonetheless, a world full of organisms that have made their home in conditions that are extreme by our standards, but entirely livable by theirs. The midnight zone is the best evidence we have that life, given time and the basic raw materials, will find a way into the darkest corners of any world it inhabits. And if that is true of the ocean, if the darkness below 1,000 meters, which is the largest dark habitat on Earth, is inhabited, then the implications extend beyond the ocean. They extend to every dark, cold, pressurized environment that we know of. They extend to the subsurface oceans of Europa and Enceladus, moons of Jupiter and Saturn, where liquid water is believed to exist beneath ice shells, in darkness and under pressure, in conditions not unlike the midnight zone of Earth's ocean. They extend to every place in the universe where liquid water exists and energy sources are present, regardless of whether those places are lit. Life may not require light. The midnight zone suggests that it does not, that light is one energy source among many, and that in the absence of light, other energy sources can sustain biological communities of surprising complexity and diversity. The darkness of the deep ocean is not the darkness of absence. It is the darkness of a world that light has never reached, a world that has been doing in the dark what the lit world has been doing in the light, for as long as the ocean has existed, and it continues to do so. Right now, in the dark, consider what it means to be the first person to observe something that has existed for hundreds of millions of years. This is the experience of the researchers who have descended in submersibles to the midnight zone, who have sat in the cramped, cold sphere of a research vessel, watching through a small porthole as the ambient light faded and the darkness of the deep ocean closed in around them, and then activated the vehicle's lights and looked out at a world that no human eye had ever seen before. The feeling, by all accounts, is not simply wonder, it is disorientation. The reference points that anchor perception at the surface, light, color, the visual richness of the world, are gone. What replaces them is something that requires adjustment. The narrow cone of light from the submersible's exterior lights, illuminating a small patch of the seafloor or the midwater, surrounded on all sides by the absolute darkness of the midnight zone. In that narrow cone of light, things appear, things that were not expected, things whose shapes and behaviors the researchers had never seen before, whose existence required new words and new categories to describe. The moment of first observation, the moment when a new species appears in a camera's field of view, when a behavior never documented before is recorded, when a habitat that was assumed to be barren turns out to be rich, is the moment when the darkness parts, briefly and partially, and reveals what it has been hiding. These moments have happened repeatedly in the history of deep-sea exploration. The discovery of the hydrothermal vent communities. The discovery of cold seeps similar communities built around the chemical energy of methane and hydrogen sulfide in the sediment in the absence of volcanic heating. The discovery of whale falls and the communities they support. The discovery of midwater organisms of extraordinary diversity and strangeness. The siphonophores that can reach lengths of 40 meters or more, the largest known colonial animals on Earth, drifting through the midnight zone in chains of hundreds of specialized individual organisms. The discovery of deep-sea corals growing in complete darkness at depths of thousands of meters, forming reef structures that rival the shallow water reefs in structural complexity. Each of these discoveries changed the understanding of what the midnight zone was. Each of them required the revision of models and assumptions that had seemed well established before the observation. Each of them made the midnight zone larger and stranger and more inhabited than it had appeared before. And after each discovery, the question that follows is always the same. What else is down there that we haven't found yet? The answer, based on the history, is more than we think. The midnight zone has surprised us every time we have looked into it carefully. Not because it is mysterious in principle. The physical conditions of the deep ocean are well understood. The physics of pressure and temperature and light absorption are not in doubt. But because the biological response to those conditions has been more inventive, more diverse, and more extensive than any prior expectation predicted. The organisms of the midnight zone have found ways to live in the dark that science did not anticipate. They have found energy sources that were not known to exist. They have evolved sensory systems, communication strategies, predator-prey relationships, and social structures that are wholly unlike anything from the surface world. They have been doing these things in the darkness for longer than most of the surface organisms we know have existed, and most of them have never been observed. This is the condition of the midnight zone at this moment in the history of science. A world that has existed for hundreds of millions of years, that is the largest habitable space on Earth, that is inhabited by organisms of extraordinary diversity and strangeness, and that has been directly observed in only a tiny fraction of its total extent. Most of the midnight zone has never been visited by any camera or instrument. Most of its inhabitants have never been documented. Most of its ecological relationships have never been studied. The darkness has kept most of its secrets simply by virtue of being dark and deep and difficult to reach. There is a particular quality to the way the ocean darkness affects people who study it. Marine biologists who spend their careers working with deep-sea material, examining specimens brought up from the midnight zone, analyzing data from deep-sea cameras and acoustic instruments, thinking about the ecology and biology of organisms that live in total darkness, often describe a particular relationship with the darkness that is different from their relationship with any other aspect of their subject. The surface ocean is visible. Its biology is continuous with the surface world in ways that make it, if not familiar exactly, at least comprehensible by analogy. Surface organisms use light. They have visual systems that function in recognizable ways. Their behaviors can be observed directly. Their ecology makes intuitive sense in terms of the basic categories: producers, consumers, decomposers that structure every ecosystem on Earth. The midnight zone resists this comprehension. It is not incomprehensible. It can be described, it can be measured, its physics can be calculated, and its biology can be observed with the right instruments. But it does not yield to intuition the way the surface world does. The darkness is the primary reason. The complete absence of light, the sense in which the midnight zone is not simply a dim version of the surface world, but a fundamentally different kind of place, makes it difficult to build an intuitive picture of what it is like to be there, what it is like to be an organism there. This difficulty has practical consequences for science. The models used to understand the midnight zone are all built from surface analogies that may not apply. The assumptions about how organisms behave, how energy flows, how biological communities are structured, all of these assumptions come from surface ecosystems, adjusted for deep conditions. But the adjustments may not be sufficient. The midnight zone may operate according to principles that are not simply modifications of surface principles, but genuinely different principles that can only be understood by studying the midnight zone on its own terms. This is why marine biologists who study the deep ocean tend to describe their work as perpetually surprising, not in the sense that their predictions are consistently wrong, but in the sense that the midnight zone consistently presents them with phenomena that their frameworks did not anticipate. The darkness is not just a physical condition of the deep ocean. It is a cognitive challenge for the scientists who try to understand it. A reminder that the intuitions built from a lifetime of experience in the lit surface world are not reliable guides to a world where light has never been. The midnight zone requires a different kind of thinking, not the thinking of someone who has been in the dark and knows what to expect when the lights come back on. The thinking of someone who has never experienced light at all, who has built their entire model of the world from pressure waves and chemical gradients and the brief, specific flashes of bioluminescence that constitute the visual world of the deep ocean. We are not those organisms. We cannot become those organisms, but we can try to understand them by being willing to set aside our surface intuitions and follow the evidence into a world where the rules are different. The evidence, every time we have followed it into the darkness, has been remarkable. The light that reaches the surface of the ocean today will, like all the light that has ever reached the surface of the ocean, stop at 1,000 meters. This is not a new fact. It has been true for as long as the ocean has existed. The light that reached the ocean's surface a billion years ago also stopped at approximately 1,000 meters. The exact depth varies with the clarity of the water, the angle of the sun, the presence or absence of suspended particles, but the general principle is unchanged. Water absorbs light. Water has always absorbed light. The darkness of the midnight zone is as old as the ocean itself. In the 4 billion years that the ocean has existed, light has never penetrated its deepest regions. The organisms that have evolved in those regions have evolved in permanent darkness. The ecosystems that have formed there have formed in permanent darkness. The evolutionary history of the midnight zone, the billions of individual organisms, the countless generations, the hundreds of millions of years of variation and selection and adaptation has unfolded entirely in the dark. This is the most basic fact about the midnight zone, and it is the fact that is hardest to fully comprehend. Not that it is dark now, not that it is dark because we cannot send light there, but that it has always been dark, and that everything that has ever happened there has happened in total darkness, and that everything that is happening there right now is happening in total darkness, and that everything that will ever happen there will happen in total darkness. The darkness is not a temporary condition. It is not a problem to be solved. It is the defining characteristic of the midnight zone, the physical fact that has shaped everything about it, from the biochemistry of its organisms, to the structure of its ecosystems, to the pace and character of evolution within it. Above 1,000 meters, light. Below 1,000 meters, darkness. This boundary has held for 4 billion years. It holds now, as you listen to this. It will hold tomorrow, and next year, and in 1,000 years, and in 1,000,000 years. As long as the ocean exists and the water absorbs the light that falls on it from above. The midnight zone is patient. It has been waiting in the dark since before animals existed. It will be waiting in the dark long after we are gone. And in that darkness, right now, something is alive that we have never seen. Something is moving through the cold, pressurized water in a way that has never been observed. Something is doing what it has always done, in the dark, in a world that light has never reached and never will. We do not know what it is. We are only beginning to ask. There is a creature that lives in the darkness of the midnight zone and carries its own light. Not a metaphor, not a philosophical observation, a literal organism, one of hundreds of species in the deep ocean that produce their own bioluminescent light, that carry within their bodies the chemical machinery for generating photons in an environment where no photons would otherwise exist. The anglerfish is the most famous of these. Its lure, the bioluminescent appendage that dangles above its enormous, tooth-filled mouth, is the image that most people have of deep-sea bioluminescence. The image from nature documentaries and children's books and Halloween decorations. But the anglerfish is only one example of a phenomenon that is, in the midnight zone, nearly universal. More than 90% of deep-sea organisms are capable of producing bioluminescence. This number, when fully considered, is remarkable. It means that the midnight zone, the zone of total darkness, The zone where no light from the surface has ever penetrated is a zone where light is present after all, not ambient light, not consistent light, but produced light flashes and glows and pulses of biological illumination, present wherever organisms are present, serving specific biological functions in specific biological contexts. The light produced by deep-sea organisms comes in a range of colors, though blue and green dominate. This is not arbitrary. Water transmits blue and green light further than red or yellow light, even over the short distances relevant to bioluminescent communication. The wavelengths that propagate most efficiently in water are the wavelengths that organisms have evolved to produce. The biochemistry of bioluminescence in the deep ocean has been shaped by the same physical properties of water that shape the penetration of sunlight from above. Blue travels furthest, and so blue is what the darkness most commonly produces. Some deep-sea organisms produce red light. This is rarer, and it serves a specific and extraordinary purpose. Most deep-sea organisms cannot see red light. Their visual pigments, evolved in the near absence of any illumination, are sensitive to the blue-green wavelengths that penetrate deepest and that bioluminescent organisms most commonly produce. An organism that produces red light is producing light that is, for most of its neighbors, invisible. It has a private lantern, a light that illuminates what it sees without advertising its presence to the organisms it is looking at. The dragonfish uses red bioluminescence as a hunting tool in exactly this way. It produces red light from a photophore, a light-producing organ beneath its eye, illuminating its field of view with light that its prey cannot detect. It can see its prey. Its prey cannot see the light that reveals them. In the darkness of the midnight zone, where bioluminescence is the only illumination, having access to a wavelength of light that other organisms cannot detect is an extraordinary predatory advantage. This is bioluminescence, not as decoration but as technology, a biological tool developed over millions of years of evolution to serve specific functional purposes in an environment where light is both precious and dangerous. Precious because it allows organisms to see, to communicate, to signal. Dangerous because it reveals the organism that produces it to any predator that can detect it. The tension between these two forces, the utility of producing light and the danger of being seen by it, has driven the evolution of bioluminescence in the midnight zone toward extraordinary specificity. Different species produce different patterns. Different patterns serve different functions. The same organism may produce different signals in different contexts. A mating signal, a warning signal, a hunting signal, using different photophores, different pulse rates, different colors. The bioluminescent vocabulary of the midnight zone is rich and specific, the product of millions of years of evolutionary refinement in an environment where communication by light is both possible and necessary. Counter-illumination is perhaps the most elegant use of bioluminescence in the deep ocean. Many mesopelagic organisms living in the twilight zone, where the faint light from above still produce bioluminescence on their undersides that matches the intensity and color of the downwelling light from above. From below, looking upward, These organisms are invisible. Their bioluminescence cancels out the silhouette that their bodies would otherwise cast against the faint light from above. They have evolved, in effect, active camouflage. Not the passive camouflage of matching a background, but the active production of light that matches the visual background they are seen against. This kind of sensory sophistication, the ability to produce light of a specific intensity and wavelength that matches an external visual environment, is not what most people think of when they think of animals. It requires the biological ability to measure the ambient light from above, to modulate bioluminescent output in response to that measurement, and to maintain the match as conditions change. It is a form of real-time environmental monitoring, carried out by organisms whose nervous systems and sensory capabilities we are only beginning to understand. The midnight zone is not simply dark. It is a world in which darkness is managed, in which the darkness is not a passive condition, but an active component of the biological environment, used and manipulated and exploited by organisms for whom the production and detection of light is a central biological competency. This is, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about the darkness of the deep ocean. It is not featureless. It is structured. The bioluminescence that fills it, the flashes and glows and pulses of biological light, each serving a specific purpose, each produced by an organism that has evolved to produce it, and detected by an organism that has evolved to detect it, constitutes a visual environment. Not the visual environment of the surface, with its ambient illumination and its rich visual textures, but a visual environment nonetheless sparse, specific, functional, and extraordinarily complex in ways that science is only beginning to map. The darkness of the midnight zone is not absence. It is a medium. And in that medium, organisms have been communicating, hunting, hiding, and finding each other for longer than any surface organism can claim. The ocean at night, on the surface, sometimes glows. This is not the bioluminescence of the midnight zone. This is a surface phenomenon, a consequence of the extraordinary density of bioluminescent plankton that can occur in certain coastal waters under certain conditions. When a boat passes through this water, the wake glows a blue-green fire that trails behind the boat and fades slowly as the disturbed organisms return to their resting state. Waves breaking on a beach at night, in the right conditions, glow with each crash, a blue fire running up the sand with each wave. This surface bioluminescence is beautiful. It is also, in the context of the midnight zone, a different thing entirely. Surface bioluminescence is produced by organisms living in the lit world, organisms that also experience sunlight, that participate in the photosynthesis-based food web of the surface ocean, that are in many ways continuous with the sunlit biological world. Their bioluminescence is a secondary feature, important, but one feature among many. The bioluminescence of the midnight zone is different in kind. For the organisms that produce it there, it is not a secondary feature. It is the primary means of visual interaction with the world. In an environment where no ambient light exists, any light that an organism produces is the totality of that organism's visual output to the world. Its bioluminescence is everything it contributes to the visual environment. Every flash, every glow, every pulse is the complete visual statement that organism makes. This is why deep-sea bioluminescence has been shaped by evolution with such extraordinary specificity. When every flash is your entire visual communication with the world, the precision and specificity of that flash matters enormously. The organisms of the midnight zone have had millions of years to refine their bioluminescent signals to make them exactly the signals that serve their functions, no more and no less. In a medium where every signal is maximally informative because there is no visual noise to compete with it. The darkness is not an obstacle to visual communication in the midnight zone. The darkness is what makes visual communication maximally efficient, a clean medium in which every produced photon is unambiguous, every flash is a deliberate statement, every glow is exactly what it is intended to be. We are surface organisms. Our visual systems were built for a world saturated with light. A world where the challenge is not finding light, but filtering and interpreting the overwhelming flood of it. We have no intuition for what it is like to live in a world where every photon is produced, where every flash of light is a deliberate act, where the darkness is the natural state and light is the deviation. The organisms of the midnight zone have that intuition. They have built their lives around it. They have been building their lives around it in their lineages for longer than we have existed. The midnight zone is their world. We are only visitors, and most of us will never go there. We'll only ever know it through the images brought back by cameras and the accounts of researchers who have descended in submersibles and the data from instruments that have been lowered into the darkness and retrieved. We will know it at second hand, mediated by technology and interpretation, never directly, but it exists. Right now, as you listen to this, it exists. Below the surface of the ocean, at depths that begin at 1,000 meters and extend to nearly 11,000 meters, covering more than half the surface of the Earth, the midnight zone is there. Cold, dark, pressurized, inhabited. The viperfish is there. The anglerfish is there. The barreleye is there. Eyes rotating upward in the darkness, scanning for bioluminescent flashes. The siphonophore is there, 40 meters long, drifting through the water in a chain of hundreds of specialized organisms. The giant squid is there, largest invertebrate on Earth, cruising through water that has never been touched by sunlight, hunting by senses that are not vision. They are all there, in the dark, doing what they have always done, and the darkness holds them as it has always held them, in the cold and the pressure and the permanent absence of light. Patient, ancient, alive. The last light in the ocean dies at approximately 1,000 meters. Not in a dramatic flash, not in a moment of visible transition. Gradually, wavelength by wavelength, photon by photon, the light that entered the ocean from above is absorbed by the water and converted to heat. The red goes first, the orange goes next. The yellow follows. The blue persists longest, filtering downward through the water column in a narrowing, dimming beam that becomes fainter and fainter with each additional meter of water. At some depth, 800 meters, 900 meters, 1,000 meters, depending on the clarity of the water. The last photon from the surface is absorbed. The light that began its journey at the surface of the sun 8 minutes ago, that crossed 150 million kilometers of space, that entered the ocean and traveled downward through hundreds of meters of water, ceases to exist. Below that depth, the ocean continues. The water continues. The organisms continue. Life continues in the cold and the pressure and the darkness, as it has always continued, with the patience and the inventiveness and the extraordinary adaptability that characterizes life wherever it exists. The darkness is not the end of the ocean. It is the beginning of a different ocean, one that we are only now beginning to understand, in the small windows that deep-sea technology has opened into it. In the accounts of researchers who have descended and observed and returned with images and data and species descriptions, and a persistent sense of wonder at what the darkness has been hiding. What the darkness has been hiding is life. Complex, diverse, ancient, strange life. Life that has found ways to thrive in conditions that, by surface standards, seem designed to prevent it. Life that has been doing this for hundreds of millions of years, in complete darkness, at temperatures near freezing, under pressures that would destroy any surface organism instantly. This is the terrifying truth about how dark the deep ocean really is. It is completely, permanently, profoundly dark. And in that darkness, something is alive. Something that has always been there. Something that we are only now beginning to see. If this journey moved something in you, consider subscribing to Sleep on Deep. Every week, we descend a little further. The ocean is waiting.